to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, and your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com.
8:35. Team Hochberg Traffic Center time, and Jim Talamonte.
In Hawthorne Woods, a vehicle fire has Old McHenry Road closed south of Quentin to Midlothian Road. Then there is the Veterans Memorial Tollway, 355, still shut down entirely in both directions due to a wreck involving a tanker spilling propane. Northbound, the closure is now from Ogden to Roosevelt, southbound Roosevelt to Butterfield. Traffic between Ogden and Butterfield still being funneled out of the area. This closure is going to be there for a while. Inbound Ryan is heavy, running right now 27 minutes, 95th to downtown. Seeing milder delays on the other expressways. Many of the access routes into downtown Chicago are open again. It's traffic. I'm Jim Talamonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next in our 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Morning showers. Maybe a thunderstorm will clear off, giving us warmer afternoon conditions with clouds and sun and a high of 86. 67 at O'Hare, 70 along the lakefront. Next news at 9, Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Papa Nicholas Coffee. Papa Nicholas, great coffee, period.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. If history and studies are any guide, one thing we know that will come from the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis and the respondent protests and investigations. Now news coming over the transom that the state of Minnesota is going to investigate the Minneapolis Police Department. Jason Riley, Wall Street Journal editorial board, writing about a study that very few people are talking about. It happens to be right on point, but that doesn't matter because we're just whipped into a political frenzy here. Policing the Police, a 2016 study by Roland Fryer, Harvard economist, and his co-author Tanya Devi. Racial differences in police use of deadly force, to the surprise of the author, who Riley spoke with, as well as many in the media and the left who take racist law enforcement as a given. Professor Fryer found no evidence of bias in police shootings in 2016. His conclusions have been echoed by researchers at the University of Maryland and Michigan State University, who in a paper last year wrote, quote, "We didn't find evidence for anti-black or anti-Hispanic disparity in police use of force across all shootings, and if anything, found anti-white disparities when controlling for race-specific crime." Mr. Fryer said in an interview that although it seemed clear to him racial disparities in police shootings stem primarily from racial disparities in criminal behavior, police departments continued to be investigated, and he suspected these investigations weren't having the intended effect. When he did a formal look at it and a paper on it, he found that when police were investigated following incidents of deadly force that went viral, like in Ferguson, in Chicago, in Baltimore, now perhaps in Minneapolis, although that's not obviously covered by this study. What happened? What happened after that? Police activity declined and violent crime spiked. Homicide goes up considerably. Total crime goes up considerably. What happens, he said, Mr. Fryer, is that the police effectively pull back. They don't stop doing their jobs, but they become less proactive and curb their interactions with civilians. This is not to say police departments shouldn't be investigated, Fryer added, but investigations have to be done with police, not to police. Riley adds editorially, one alternative is to target individual officers for wrongdoing rather than putting entire departments under a cloud like, say, we've done in Chicago. The activists, this is Riley writing, the activists tell us what happened to George Floyd is commonplace and racially motivated, but the empirical evidence points in the opposite direction. I would never have guessed that if police stopped putting in the effort, the homicides would change like this, said Roland Fryer. You hear people say, oh, we want to police our own neighborhoods. Get out. No, you don't want that. I guess I always knew it was a foolish idea, but I didn't realize it was this deadly. Harvard economist Roland Fryer. How much has that been part of any conversation you've heard on the cable news channels or even within your particular community? Well, somebody who knows this all too well, because she wrote a bestseller on it, War on Cops, is Heather McDonald. She's the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and New York Times bestselling author of another book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Heather, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Don, for having me on.
So the phrase that we're hearing over and over and over again with respect to police departments, in spite of the research that we just poured over, is systemic racism. That's the problem with police departments in big metropolitan areas, systemic racism, and even in smaller ones.
The cops go where the crime is. What we have in this country is not a police problem. We have a crime problem. And if the cops ignored the cries of the good, law-abiding people who say, please, I need protection from the drug dealers, I need protection from the youths who are hanging out in my lobby, smoking weed and selling drugs, trespassing, that would be racist. It used to be, maybe 100 years ago, the police said, well, there's higher crime in black communities. That's just sort of the way it is, a fact of nature. And they paid less attention now because we're data-driven, and the police are acutely conscious of when people beg them for police protection, they go where crime is happening. They don't make those decisions themselves. They hope against hope. Every time they get a shots fired call, that for once they're going to be given the description of a white suspect. It almost never happens. In Chicago, whites and blacks are each about 30% of the city's population. Blacks commit 80% of all shootings and murders, whites about 1%. A black Chicagoan is 50 times more likely to commit a shooting than a white Chicagoan. That is facts that the police are dealt with. They can't control it. And if you don't want the police in your community, the solution is to step up for fathers to get involved, raise boys that have a sense of self-control. But the cops, again, it's not their decision. They're going to help the children. In Chicago in 2016, there were 4,300 people shot, one person every 2 hours. Wow. 24 children under the age of 12 were shot. Tavon Tanner, 10-year-old boy, the bullet ripped through his kidney and spleen. A 2-year-old shot on Father's Day. The cops, so 4,300 people shot. The cops in Chicago shot about 25 people that year. That's 0.6% of all shootings. The problem in the black community is that there is a percentage of it, a small percentage, who are committing the crimes. That's what police are responding to.
And you wrote in your piece that, the media visibly exhilarated by this latest explosion of black rage. Can you explain?
Well, this has been a long-standing trope. The media is left-wing. They are products of the university environment. They are an absolute symbol of elite establishment culture, and they are committed to the narrative that America is systemically biased. And it gives them sort of a charge with the sort of wannabe revolutionaries that finally people are rising up and are going to take down the white establishment. Of course, all of these politicians and all of these media figures who get up standing and breathlessly covering these riots, this carnage, this mayhem, and refuse to call it riots. At best we get unrest, but usually it's protests. They don't worry about their homes. Mayor de Blasio, Pritzker, they have security details. They're going to be guarded. It's the poor immigrant shop owners and people that have no protection that have to worry about things. But the elites who are virtually cheering this on are not the ones whose neighborhoods are going to be devastated afterwards and won't have any place, if they're elderly, to go to shop.
With respect to the bad officers in police departments, of course there are some. I mean, New York, 35,000 cops, Chicago, 12,000 cops. Of course there are going to be some officers. It's a matter of accountability. And so what about what Jason Riley suggested, going after individual officers rather than these sort of federal consent decrees or these declarations about systemic racism in a department that requires everybody to undergo implicit bias training and so on and so forth? What's the approach to deal with bad officers?
Well, that's fine. It's not as if that doesn't happen. Departments do go after bad officers. The reason for these consent decrees is that somebody persuades the staff attorneys in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which are, they've been there for 20 years. They themselves are very left-wing, that there is a systemic problem in a police department, and that the bad officers are a result of a pattern or practice of police abuse. And so that's what leads to these destructive consent decrees. I mean, the Chicago consent decree is over 200 pages long and is filled with these draconian paperwork deadlines that have to be met, to an absolute T about filing reports, that when officers are desperately needed back on the streets to actually respond to real problems, which is violence. It's violence. I'm always stunned at the racism of the mainstream media. If there were 24 white children shot in Chicago, that would be a national story. But if a black child is shot and it's not by a cop, the media turns its eyes away.
Right, or the flip side, if it's a black person, even black officers that have been killed this week. I mean, they're covered, but I mean, you're not going to. Most people will never even read, much less remember the name of the 77-year-old retired St. Louis police captain who was killed yesterday morning, or the Oakland, the federal security officer in Oakland who was assassinated. They won't pay any attention to that. Those people will just come and go. But everybody will remember the name George Floyd. And I'm not saying they shouldn't remember the name George Floyd as an incident of bad policing, but it's so disproportionate, and so it distorts your understanding of what's actually happening.
Right. Most people have no idea of what law-abiding residents of inner-city neighborhoods have to put up with, because there's virtually a ban on it. I would say the Chicago Tribune is actually one of the best in actually covering, at least in their online edition, the shootings. The New York Times, it's just a complete blackout. There's nothing. Fortunately, we have the New York Post here, but still, of course, I don't think there's any dearth of attention on bad officers and bad shootings, but there is a complete indifference to understanding what is the driving force in policing today, and it's not race, it's crime.
Yeah, and then I don't know if you heard this, but our mayor last night, she addressed the city, and this is her new plan, to have community members be teachers at the police academy and have youth-led tours of neighborhoods for officers.
It's absurd. These cops. I mean, Chicago had community policing, the CAPS program that Wesley Skogan wrote about. It was viewed, actually, by the Obama years, some of the most left-wing criminologists, like Jeffrey Fagan and Tracy Mears at Yale, viewed Chicago as a model of community policing years ago. That ended with the Laquan McDonald shooting, which was a very controversial and difficult shooting. But it's not as if Chicago has not, the police officers, I don't know any department that isn't desperately trying to reach out.
There's this use of force project has put out some studies on various aspects of policing, from the body cameras and how much they impact a reduction in police-involved violence or not. And they looked at consent decrees among a number of police departments, about a dozen throughout the country, and they find that police-involved shootings declined in cities where the police departments were under federal oversight, as opposed to those where they were not. So that they have some loose correlation here, and I'm just wondering if you've seen any of that research, and if you believe there's any validity to the idea that federal oversight reduces police-involved violence, even if it, at the same time, may exacerbate violence on the streets between civilians.
Well, I don't know what study you're referring to, but if you're not talking about the Fryer study again, are you?
No. This is a use of force project, yeah.
I see. Well, that's good if it's not accompanied by a rise in crime. I mean, the reason that officers use their weapons, this has been known by the Justice Department for decades. The biggest predictor, the biggest determinant of officer use of force is civilian behavior. Officers are responsive. They will escalate their own use of force to the point needed to subdue a suspect. So if you go along with arrest, if you don't resist arrest, you're not at chance of getting shot or having more force used against you. So if the officer's guns use is down without, because they're not engaging with suspects, because they're driving on by, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
So I want to know what happens to crime in those communities as well.
She is Heather McDonald. She's the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor of City Journal, New York Times bestselling author of The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. Heather, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
If you're a healthy, self-employed small business owner with income too high to qualify for an Obamacare subsidy, I have good news. Recent regulatory changes have created new, lower-priced health insurance options that are available to you right now. These policies include a nationwide PPO with access to Chicago's teaching hospitals like University of Chicago, Northwestern, Rush, and Lurie Children's Hospital.